just before we start the show, I want to take an opportunity to invite you to join me for the Podfluence Weekly newsletter, which is available both on LinkedIn and through the official newsletter channel. Now, if you are on LinkedIn and it's easier for you to follow there, then please just click on the link in the show notes, which will take you straight to Podfluence on LinkedIn, where you can subscribe for free and get weekly updates on Podfluence articles as well as episodes. If you would like to subscribe to the full newsletter where you'll get additional materials and, as my little incentive to you, my pre-podcast guest checklist for you to use when you're appearing on podcast shows so that you can be fully prepared every single time, then please click the link to the official newsletter in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Speaking of Influence podcast with virtual business speaker, presentation skills and influence coach, John Ball. Remember to like and subscribe. The Speaking of Influence podcast is uploaded and distributed using Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout makes it really easy to get your podcast started and out to a wide audience with lots of tips and useful tools to help you on your way. If you're interested, check the link in the show notes and start your podcast today. Well, welcome back to the show, and today I'm really happy to introduce someone who is a specialist in stoic philosophy, and I read, or should say listened to, an amazing book by him just recently called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. His name is Donald Robertson. Please welcome to the show, Donald Robertson.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really happy to be speaking with you. And I mentioned to you just before we started recording, I've been following you on social media for some time, and you definitely are one of the leading expert voices in Stoicism.
I've just been doing it for a long time. That's how that happens.
It was really nice. It was really nice in your book to hear your background about why you've actually ended up getting into Stoicism. Would it be okay to share a bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the funny thing was I really was into Stoicism before it was cool, or at least, people might debate that, but I distinctly remember everyone telling me, why are you studying this nerdy, obscure subject that no one's interested in? But not long after that, it became more popular. So it started when I was a teenager, and I kind of dropped out of school and stuff. My father passed away when I was quite young, and I kind of got into trouble with the cops and things like that, and I ended up in a rehabilitation scheme for young offenders. And I decided, with the help of a communication skills teacher, actually, to turn my life around a bit. I thought I'd do something, and I went to university and I studied philosophy, and I was looking for a philosophy of life. And one of the few major schools of ancient philosophy that isn't typically part of the undergraduate curriculum, Stoicism. So I spent 4 years at Aberdeen, and they never mentioned it once. Wow. I studied Plato and Aristotle and other aspects of Greek philosophy, but not the Stoics. And then after I graduated, I stumbled across the works of Pierre Hadot, a French scholar. He focuses on the idea of philosophy as a way of life. I read his books and was training as a psychotherapist and counsellor at the time. So I immediately recognised, and it seemed odd to me, that Hadot had listed all these psychological, he called them spiritual exercises that he found in Stoicism, and he compared them to Christian contemplative techniques. He'd catalogued them and written about them in great detail, and it seemed remarkable to me that the one thing he hadn't ever done was draw the analogy with modern psychology or psychotherapy. And so that seemed really obvious to me. So sometimes in life, you find a book kind of writes itself almost. So I thought, well, if I don't write this, someone else will. It seems like a really obvious thing. So I kind of ended up writing a book about it. And then when you write one book, people ask you to write others. And then nearly 25 years later, after I first stumbled across Stoicism, I'm still talking to people about it. But I'm still 100% committed to Stoicism. I found it clicked with me, made a lot of sense, and it still makes sense to me today.
But you teach this now, yes?
Yeah, I started teaching it in a sense early on because I always did a lot of workshops, and I trained psychotherapists in the UK and supervised them. So I ended up teaching a lot of therapists initially about Stoicism. speaking about it at conferences and stuff. And now I run online courses about it and so on, write books about it, give a lot of talks about it, more aimed at the general public. I started off more with psychotherapists, and now it's become more of a general audience.
Yeah, I mean, I see some elements of Stoic philosophy relating to things like CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, right? And so I can see that these sorts of principles do get used. What effects has this kind of philosophy had on you particularly in your life?
In my personal life, I think Stoicism gave me a sense of direction when I really needed it. Many people say they see Stoicism like a kind of secular alternative to Christianity. And what they often mean by that is it gives them something that's like a religion, but really a philosophy. It's not based on faith or revelation. It's based on philosophical reasoning. But it gives them a whole worldview and a set of fundamental moral values through which to interpret life, find a purpose, a sense of direction. So I'd say that's the main thing I got from Stoicism. But it also, the main corollary of that, or consequence of it, is that arguably it helps us to build emotional or psychological resilience, and that's partly why it dovetails with modern cognitive behavioural therapy, like you said.
Yeah, I do. I've been doing coaching, professional coaching, for a number of years now, and certainly since having studied more about Stoicism from people like yourself and is Brian Irving, was it? I think, but Ryan Holiday.
Bill Irvine and Ryan Holiday.
Irvine, yeah. So yeah, I think I've certainly applied a lot of that for myself and got a lot of value from it, but also find myself using it with clients quite often because the philosophy of it really does stand the test of time, and the mental resilience aspects of it, especially this year, are really important.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of thought eventually we'll reach peak Stoicism in the sense that people will get fit. It seemed like it's a kind of fad, like everyone's rediscovered it and they've got really into it. But it keeps growing and growing. And then the pandemic happened and it just went through the roof, like the number of interviews and articles and so on about Stoicism, just as we thought it might be kind of plateauing, has kind of shot up again. Book sales and Stoicism have gone through the roof since the start of the pandemic, right, for obvious reasons, maybe. But also, for instance, the main classic is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which was written in the middle of a pandemic called the Antonine Plague. And in part, that's one of the main things that he's coping with. And so you mentioned coaching as well. Like, without a shadow of doubt, I was mainly... The first book I wrote on Stoicism was called The Philosophy of CBT, and it was an academic text. It was mainly meant for psychotherapists and philosophers, but it reached a lay audience, as we say, like a general audience. And life coaches actually seem to have got more interested in Stoicism than psychotherapists, which is something I was wrong about. I thought the psychotherapists would be all over it. And for a couple of reasons, actually, they've been a bit slow on the uptake, but coaches have embraced Stoicism over the past few years.
Yeah, and to me that's kind of interesting as well, because I tend to think that the coaching industry, or most coaches I know, really tend to love more of the sort of new agey woo-woo spirituality kind of stuff, which Stoicism really isn't that. It's a very practical life philosophy.
Yeah, it's a philosophy in the Socratic tradition, so certainly the ancient Greeks and Romans had their superstitions and their religions and their cult practices and so on. But Stoicism stands out as broadly speaking, is a very rational, grounded view of things. It's a very down-to-earth philosophy in many respects. So I think the reason that CBT practitioners, increasingly, there's a lot of pressure. There always has been. Now there's more and more pressure on clinical psychologists and CBT practitioners to stick very closely to evidence-based protocols that have been established by researchers. And so because of that, I think they feel that they kind of haven't got the space or time or the headroom to go off and read classics as much as maybe coaches and trainers have. That's my best attempt at trying to understand it, because CBT is based on Stoicism, it's derived from Stoicism, so I just assumed they would be kind of like, you know, the first people to engage with it. But it's been other groups of people that have got passionately into Stoicism over the past few years.
Interestingly enough, I think a lot of that has maybe been fueled by people like Tim Ferriss and Holiday as well.
Yeah, Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday are the two people that have really catapulted Stoicism into a whole different domain, like a whole new audience.
It's been interesting to see, and I certainly remember downloading the Tao of Seneca from Tim Ferriss after him getting those books published, and found them very interesting. One of the things that there may be some people who are watching or listening who haven't really come across Stoicism, amazingly still, or are really wondering, maybe have heard about it and don't really know what it's about. I mean, what are some of the nutshell principles of Stoicism that would sum it up for people, perhaps?
Well, first of all, we should say a tiny bit about the history. You know, when we talk Stoicism, we're talking about an ancient Greek school of philosophy that was founded in 301 BC at Athens by a shipwrecked Phoenician merchant called Zeno of Citium. And most of the early texts are lost apart from fragments, but Stoicism flourished for nearly 500 years in Greece, and then later in the Roman Republic and the Empire. And so the main surviving texts we have are letters and essays by Seneca, who was an orator and a speechwriter for the Emperor Nero, Epictetus, who was a freed slave who became a teacher of philosophy at Rome and later moved to Nicopolis in Greece, and Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor and is best known today for having appeared on screen with Russell Crowe in the movie Gladiator in the form of Richard Harris. If you remember that was another thing that made people interested in Stoicism. It's a little bit older now, but when that movie came out, a lot of people started to read the Meditations.
Right.
Was there making a sequel?
Oh, really? Well, I guess not with the same character, right? Because he died.
With his with the children of Lucilla, if I remember rightly.
I remember really loving that film, and I watched it over again, especially the soundtrack. It has the most stunning soundtrack. But did you find it to be a particularly stoic film?
No, there's a couple of articles, but actually I wrote an article and a couple of other people wrote articles. There's maybe 2 or 3 lines in it. There's one in particular that looks like it's kind of a paraphrase. It's something that it's like at the end where he says something like, someone once told me, he's talking about Marcus Aurelius, that death smiles at us all and all that we could do is smile back, or something like that. And that sounds like a paraphrase of one of the passages in the Meditations. But other than that, there's only very fleeting references. But actually, I read in an interview recently that Russell Crowe, when he was making that movie, here's a bit of movie trivia for you kids. Russell Crowe, when he was making that movie, apparently was really into the Meditations and really wanted more philosophy in the script. And he kind of fought for that. But in the end, they just got 1 or 2 little passing references. But if they do make a sequel, then maybe, who knows, there might be a little bit more philosophy in it.
I think that could be good. I mean, are there any films that are particularly stoic that aren't necessarily maybe
refer to it? There's a terrible movie that I saw recently called, that was kind of like a sort of, how would you describe it? A revenge movie, like well, I mean, it's mediocre. It's not terrible, but
kind of thing Liam Neeson likes to do.
Yeah, like a Liam Neeson type thing. And it's called Acts of Vengeance, and it's got, weirdly, this guy falls through the window of a bookshop. He gets stabbed in the leg at the beginning, and he grabs a paperback and stems the blood flow in his thigh with the first thing that comes to hand, which is this paperback book. And he staggers home bleeding, and then he looks at this book, and it turns, surprise, surprise, it happens to be the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And then he starts reading this book, and there's little references to it throughout the rest of the movie. So there you go. Like, it's not the best showcase for Stoicism, but there is a movie, an action movie that references Stoicism. I think those are the only ones that I can really think of where it's kind of an explicit thing. But and then there's like an old movie, is it The Decline and Fall of the the Roman Empire, with Alec Guinness playing Marcus Aurelius in it from like the late 60s or something. There's not much philosophy in that, but it tells us about Marcus Aurelius. So there's one or two little kind of obscure.
Yeah. What would be the main traits of Stoicism that would make you think something was that other than sort of quoting the Stoics? We tend to have this idea of Stoicism as just being a bit keep your chin up, stiff upper lip kind of thing, which is
that brings us back to defining it, doesn't it? So we should do exactly what you've done, which is start off by saying what it isn't. If listeners will forgive us for taking a slightly roundabout path. So the word Stoicism today, when it's written with a lowercase s, means an unemotional coping style. And that's a completely different thing. It's loosely related to, but really a caricature of, a degraded form of it's a very simplistic idea, just kind of having a stiff upper lip. Whereas capital S Stoicism is an ancient Greek school of philosophy that survived for about 500 years and was much more nuanced and complex. And the reason it's important to distinguish these things, particularly from my point of view, is that in psychology, we have established well-known questionnaires for measuring lowercase Stoicism, like the Liverpool Stoicism scale is one of the tools that's used. And it's well known among researchers that lowercase Stoicism is actually bad for you. Like, it's unhealthy, and it leads to, not to resilience, but to psychological vulnerability. Whereas capital S Stoicism is the philosophical basis for cognitive therapy, which is the leading evidence-based form of psychotherapy. So the research literature suggests that although these two words sound identical to listeners, one of them refers to something that's actually unhealthy psychologically, whereas the other one refers to something that's potentially healthy, opposite end of the scale. So it's important to make that clear.
For sure.
What do they believe? The ancient Stoics believed that virtue is the only true good. That's their foundational principle. It's an ethic that's the core of Stoicism, and we call that a virtue ethic. And by virtue, I think the word arete that they use is often better translated as moral wisdom, because it's a kind of insight or wisdom that allows us to understand the value of things, and then that gives us a sense of purpose and direction in life. And the Stoics think that someone who believes that virtue is the only true good, and therefore all external things like health, wealth, reputation, are relatively indifferent. What's more important is the use that you make of them. So money won't make you happy, as it were. Like, in the hands of a genocidal tyrant, money would be a bad thing. Like, it's like coffee. They say it allows you to do stupid things more quickly and with more energy. So that's like money allows you to do stupid things more quickly and more easily. So money in itself isn't intrinsically good. It just allows you to exercise your will more on your environment and on other people. Well, that's good if you happen to be wise and virtuous, but if you happen to be foolish and vicious, then that might not be a great idea. So the Stoics say these things are what they call indifference, external things. Like, it's natural to prefer wealth over poverty and health over sickness and friends over enemies, but they're not intrinsically good in the way that moral wisdom is. It's moral wisdom that makes everything else good, and moral ignorance that makes everything else bad, or vice that makes everything else bad. But the main corollary of that is that if you go through this conversion where you suddenly place more value on your own character than on your possessions, for instance, you're going to probably become more emotionally resilient as a consequence, because you're going to be better able to cope with loss and setbacks in life and misfortune, and you're going to be less perturbed by other people's opinions of you and less prone to manipulation, the Stoics would say, because they would say it's harder for a tyrant to threaten or manipulate a Stoic, because there's nothing that he can threaten to take away from them. He can't. Epictetus said nobody can take away your own freedom, and that's all that you really need to focus on if you want to be a Stoic. So this is an ethic that has psychological implications for resilience building. In a nutshell.
One of the techniques that I know that I think I learned it reading from William Evans' book, but was the negative visualization philosophy, and I tried that. because it doesn't seem appealing. I mean, it's something I talk to my clients about. I frame it up first with saying, I know this doesn't seem like a nice thing to do. Like you think, especially out in the personal development world, where so many people say you attract what you think about, kind of thing. To me, it's just kind of bullshit. But
it is bullshit. Yeah, it's completely.
So many people say this kind of thing. It's like, well, that's why people are resistant to something like. After having heard that for so long, something like negative visualization. I said, no, for me, it was essential. In doing this, it actually was something that made me appreciate so much more what I have in my life right now, and to help let go and recognize and let go of the attachment of it's not always going to be this good. It's not always going to be this wonderful. Appreciate it now.
Well, in cognitive therapy, there's a long tradition of getting people to visualize unpleasant scenes or feared catastrophes and so on. And I could bore you all day with a very detailed. I used to train psychotherapists for a living, so I would talk all day about the many different ways. Off the top of my head, I would say there are like about 6 or 7 distinct psychological processes that we can potentially activate during mental rehearsal or imaginal exposure or whatever you want. There are a bunch of different names that we use in psychology to refer to similar techniques that all involve closing your eyes and picturing some kind of unpleasant situation repeatedly, usually. The most important one in psychology and the most robustly established. So I'd say this also to people who are like, well, I don't know if this is a good idea. I'd say 2 things, 3 things, 4 things. There's like a bunch of things we could say about this. Probably, I would argue that the most robustly established technique in the entire field of psychotherapy research is what we call exposure therapy. And the mechanism underlying it we call emotional habituation. And that's the finding which we've known for well over 50 or 60 years now. It's the foundation of all anxiety treatment and evidence-based psychotherapy. That anxiety abates naturally through repeated prolonged exposure under controlled conditions. And so what that means is that if you visualize something, you've got a cat phobia and you visualize cats, you're frightened of losing your job and you picture yourself losing your job. If you do that repeatedly and for long enough, and as long as you're not doing other things that would maintain your anxiety, then your anxiety will naturally wear off, and it'll wear off permanently if you keep doing it.
Yeah.
But a couple of things we know about it are that it's very common, like people have a strong urge to terminate exposure prematurely. So of course, when people get anxious, they think, screw this, I'm not going to do it anymore. And the risk in doing that is it can actually lead to sensitization. So I would attach a caveat, which is this technique is problematic for 2 reasons when people use it as a self-help technique. So one is that there'll be a natural tendency for them not to do it long enough, in which case they could actually make themselves more distressed about the thing that they're picturing about. And also, I guess there's 3 problems. The other one is that people, if you just do this without doing anything else, if you just keep it really simple and just picture the scene, your anxiety will abate. But if you're trying to do lots of other things at the same time, like trying to breathe differently, if you're having a dialogue in your mind where you're worrying about the implications of things or overthinking it, then again, these could also prevent habituation and make your anxiety worse. So you could turn exposure therapy into just worrying, like, or ruminating morbidly if you're not careful. So we see clients do that all the time. So as a form of self-help, we'd have to be like, be careful that you don't do that. And then the other point is that if somebody has severe problems, like if they have panic disorder or if they were severely clinically depressed, when they pictured something upsetting, it might become too overwhelming for them, in which case they probably would also terminate the exposure prematurely, and then it could backfire on them. So I would say this is one of the few stoic techniques that I'd say we have to be a little bit cautious about using it in practice if you don't have panic disorder or severe depression or psychosis. And you are patient about doing it, you pick something that's not overwhelming and you just keep it really simple, you're not allowing yourself to do anything that might make your anxiety worse, then it will work pretty well for the majority of people, even just in a kind of self-help context. But to put it another way, in a clinical setting, it usually needs a little bit more assessment and supervision to make sure that technique works well. Bill Irvine's rationale for doing it is different from the Stoics' rationale for doing it. So sometimes Bill Irvine's book is great, But in some ways, he describes Stoicism in a way that makes it sound a little bit more like Epicureanism, which is a rival philosophical school. And his rationale for doing this kind of exposure therapy is that he thinks if you imagine losing things that you're attached to, it'll make you, it'll prevent, what do you call it, hedonic adaptation, and therefore you'll learn to experience more gratitude for things in the present moment while you have them. And that might be a reason for doing it, but it's not the Stoics' main reasoning. It's not a clinician's main reason for doing it. In clinical practice, the main reason for doing that technique is emotional habituation. And the Stoics, there's a couple of hints that they were also aware of this. Plutarch, a later writer who's influenced by the Stoics, says explicitly that he understands this concept. And actually, in one of Aesop's fables, really clearly explains it. So there were ancient thinkers that grasped this concept of anxiety wearing off if you patiently keep exposing yourself to an upsetting scene. But the Stoics put more emphasis on something else, which they don't have a name for. But today we would call cognitive distancing. It's a technical term that we use in cognitive therapy. And so the Stoics say, look, they think that when we see things as catastrophic, or somebody is an idiot or an asshole, or, when we experience strong emotions, it's because we're fusing or merging our value judgments with external events that are outside our direct control. So there's the famous saying of Epictetus, is quoted by all cognitive therapists. It's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And so that articulates this concept of cognitive distancing. So if I say something is big or small, or it's wood, or it's metal, or it's black, or it's white, these are descriptions of physical properties. But if I say it's a catastrophe, that sounds like a description of the external event, but really it's more like me going, oh no. It's more like an expression of my value judgment and emotional reaction to it, to say it's a catastrophe. So there's a sense in which it's more arbitrary and subjective. It comes totally from me rather than being a description of the event. In nature, there are no catastrophes, because nature is indifferent to everything. There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Right. And so other people might view the same event and not think it's a catastrophe, or even more shockingly, I myself, a year from now, might look at the same event and not view it as a catastrophe any longer, even though the facts are identical. So the Stoics want us to, Marcus Aurelius says we need to separate our value judgments from external events and realize that it's not a catastrophe, but I'm catastrophizing it. As we say in therapy, I'm choosing to look at it through these lens. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, compared it to wearing coloured spectacles, like the opposite of rose-tinted glasses, like shitty coloured glasses, catastrophe coloured glasses. And he said that cognitive distancing would be like taking the glasses off and realising that you're just looking at the world through catastrophe-tinted lenses, and the guy next to you is wearing rose-tinted glasses or whatever. You could swap if you wanted, right? But when you see the catastrophe, you're seeing the lens rather than a quality of the event itself.
Right.
And so the Stoics think that we should take ownership for that. And so when they do this premeditatio malorum, this is the Latin name that Seneca gives it, negative visualization. You could translate that as premeditation of adversity or premeditation of misfortune. When the Stoics doing it, they're actually rehearsing viewing it with indifference. So they're rehearsing imagining their partner leaving them or getting sacked from their job, but at the same time realizing that the awfulness of it is just a value judgment that they're projecting onto it, and that's a kind of arbitrary subjective thing. So we call this also called verbal diffusion, like separating the value judgment from the external event. So it's quite unlike the rationale that Bill Irvine gives to it. And I think the Stoic rationale is better. It's more consistent with the way that cognitive therapy works today. We now know that this cognitive distancing is also one of the most robust and effective techniques in the field. There are many research studies on it. And it's used for a range of problems, even quite severe problems nowadays. So the Stoics were way ahead of their time in that regard. And the other thing I'd say about Bill Irvine's version is he calls it negative visualization. Now, for the Stoics, in a sense, the thing that they're picturing, being sacked from work, like getting sick, losing all your money or whatever, isn't negative. They want us to realize that the negativity comes from our own value judgment. So if anything, it would be indifferent visualization. And sometimes people, when they say they struggle with that technique, I hear a lot from people who try some of the techniques and I'm not sure how to get them to work.
Yeah.
They say, I'm visualizing all these negative things and it's just making me sad. I think, yeah, it made me sad too if I visualized loads of negative things. But what the Stoics want you to do is to realize there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, and that negativity is a value judgment that you're imposing on it. So you're not gaining it from the way you've described it. Like your value judgment is still completely fused with the event. You haven't separated the two, which is the real point of the technique.
So it's more like de-emotionalizing the whole thing and making it like this isn't. It's just a thing. It's
and another way of looking at that, which the Stoics also talk about, you could look at it from a slightly different. One way of looking at it is just to take ownership for the value judgment. But the flip side of that would be to describe the event in more objective language, right? And so the Stoics compare that to a physician describing disease in a patient. Like he does it very objectively and in a very matter-of-fact way. Or they could just say and they do say in the way that maybe we talk about somebody else's problems, we're able to do it in a matter-of-fact or detached way. Like when the same thing happens to us, though, it's, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening to me. And so learning to describe things in a factual, objective way makes it easier for us to problem solve, figure out coping strategies and do something about it. And that leads us neatly, my friend, into this topic of rhetoric. Right. Because something because this has obviously got to do with language. Like cognitive therapy always struck me as being very much about language. We talk cognitive this, cognitive that. Cognitive means thinking, but our thoughts are expressed in language. And so everything cognitive about cognitive therapy is also basically linguistic. It's a particular use of language we're talking about. In cognitive therapy, traditionally, we help clients to identify thinking errors like overgeneralization and unfounded assumptions and leaping to conclusions about what other people are thinking, which we call mind reading, or catastrophizing, which is exaggerating things. And those are similar also to, not unlike fallacies in formal logic or tropes that are used in rhetoric. Catastrophizing is hyperbole. It's a form of rhetoric. In a way, it's a kind of alarmist form of rhetoric that we use. And I think that's it's strange that we don't frame it like that in cognitive therapy. Because it's almost like we evolved rhetoric as a way of manipulating the emotions of other people. Maybe that puts too much of a negative spin on it. But we evolved rhetoric as a way of communicating with other people, evoking emotions, like focusing their attention, having an effect on an audience. But somehow it's like we slipped unintentionally into using the same kind of strategies on ourselves, like in the privacy of our own minds. And so we use metaphors that are vivid and evocative. Like I have a client that does a presentation and they'll say, I just felt as if somebody bit my nose off for no reason. And I wished they shot me down in flames and I wish the ground would open up and swallow me. And if they were describing the same event in objective language, they might just say somebody said that they disagreed with something. Right. Which sounds far less anxiety-provoking, right? But they've used colourful language. They've used metaphors in particular and hyperbole to really create this dramatic effect. But they're doing it to themselves. And it's like they're not really thinking about the consequences of it. Would you want to make it seem more dramatic to yourself? Like if that's just making you feel anxious and freaking you out? Yeah. And so often in therapy, we can see that clients are abusing language unintentionally, like as a way of like making themselves feel even more upset about things. And so the Stoics had this kind of love-hate. They were kind of frenemies with the sophists and rhetoricians, because Cicero, I think it was, said that the Stoics wrote books on rhetoric which Cicero, like one of the greatest orators of antiquity, thought were terrible. Because he said Stoic rhetoric's rubbish. Like, he's like, you guys just want to stick to the facts and explain everything really objectively. And he goes, that's not how rhetoric works in a court of law or in a political speech or something. You need to whip up the audience's emotions. And the Stoics were like, well, we kind of want to undo that, right? Because we think when you guys do that, you're distorting reason, and you're like manipulating truth, and like the anger and fear gets in the way of people thinking things through rationally. And, you know, funnily enough, this has all become very topical. It's always been topical. But today, I cannot think of a finer example of the rhetoric of politicians distorting reason, whipping up emotions in a way that's counterproductive to dealing with a crisis than the current pandemic, and the way that political propaganda has been used to distort public health information. This is something I care about, having worked in public health and evidence-based practice for many years. Anyone that works in that field, I think at the moment, is just shocked at the absolute dog's breakfast, like the mess that we're currently observing, particularly in the United States, right, but in other countries as well. And the misinformation and the confusion and the anger and outrage and fear that people experience, and the extent to which it's whipped up by the news media, social media, and political hacks, like, to be blunt about it, I think it's fair to say, right?
Yeah.
Whatever side of the debate people are on politically, I think they can recognise it. So it's a shame that politics and rhetoric have clouded the public health debate around the virus.
Yeah, I think we all see it. We all know it's going on. We don't necessarily all understand exactly how it works, but there are certain elements of rhetoric that's certainly, you see it. You see it particularly in the UK, that they're three-word pithy phrases that still set in US politics as well, really, that still get people elected. The recent elections were get Brexit done is like these pithy three-word phrases that are rhetorical devices. But you also, like you said, all the hyperbole, all the metaphor that goes in, making this huge emotional drama about things. Very often they're saying all these things without really saying anything, and not really conveying information, actually just conveying drama and outrage.
One other thing that you can do rhetorically, there's good and bad rhetoric, I should say that from the outset. And that's another topic I've got keyed up that we'll come to in a moment. So we're talking about the abuse of rhetoric, let's say. Right. So one of the things that a rhetorician or an orator can do is present facts selectively. So you cherry pick. Right? And this is something that's fundamentally counter to the scientific method. And the experts in doing that are newspapers and the news media. So the one piece of advice that I feel like I would give to anybody that's looking at this at the moment is not to get public health advice from the mainstream news media, right? Because whether they're left or right or whatever, they always misrepresent scientific. Like, you're much better going to like credible scientific sources, even government sources directly, government reports, or things like New Scientist, Scientific American.
I get my science news from The Scientist every week.
The Telegraph and The Guardian and Fox, they will just pick whatever information fits their agenda and then kind of ignore or trivialize anything that doesn't. And there's an art to doing that, focusing the attention or just ignoring certain. We call it selective thinking in therapy. It's fundamental to many mental health problems. So, for example, when somebody is anxious, they'll spot signs of danger and focus on them like a magnifying glass, but they'll ignore signs of safety that other people might notice that would counteract it. Yeah. So they don't arrive at a balanced appraisal of the situation because they're only looking at it from a one-sided perspective. And it's the same with depression. When people are clinically depressed, they have cognitive biases. So they'll only look at the bad stuff. If someone with clinical depression writes a book and they get 100 reviews on Amazon, and 99 of them say that it's either amazing or it's at least, reasonably good, but there's one review that says it was garbage and they're like the worst writer in the universe, a depressed person will only talk, think, remember the negative review, and they'll kind of ignore, trivialize or sideline all the other ones in many cases because they have this unconscious negative schematic bias that primes them to focus. It's like confirmation bias. They'll look for information that maintains their depression. And we say angry people will look for evidence that maintains their anger and ignore evidence that would contradict it. So this is one of the risks with whipping up emotions like that strong. They maintain themselves by looking at details in a selective way. And the Stoics wanted us to be more balanced and more rounded in our appraisal of situations, to calmly look at all of the facts. And that, often that means arriving at a kind of provisional or mixed conclusion, acknowledging ambiguity and uncertainty in some cases. So that leads us maybe into what's the relationship between these things? This all kicked off with the sophists kind of, in a sense, arrived on the scene in ancient Athens round about, 450 BC, a little bit earlier. So the first major sophist was a guy called Protagoras, and then there were a bunch of other famous sophists that followed in his wake. And they were revolutionary figures in the education and the culture of Athens. We get our word sophistication from the sophists. They taught culture, virtue, sophistication, and the use of language in political assemblies and in law courts to the Athenians. And they became like pop stars. They would tour all the cities and they get paid a fortune for giving these speeches. And this is where, in a sense, how rhetoric and oratory developed. They're also like self-improvement gurus. And wherever you'd find a sophist in ancient Athens, you'd also find Socrates, because he followed them around. And he loved the sophists. He had a frenemy relationship with the sophists. He loved to argue with them, but he also liked to quote them. So he didn't just hate it. He liked a lot of things about them, but he also said, "Look, you guys are kind of the opposite of me, because you will say whatever the crowd want to hear, right? You just want to attract the biggest crowd and get the biggest round of applause. So today we would say you're sellouts." It's essentially what Socrates was calling these guys. And he said, look, real philosophy is the opposite. Sometimes you have to tell people things that they don't want to hear. And, so you have to think things through more meticulously. Yeah. He said the sophists would give long, elaborate speeches, but they didn't really engage in the question and answer approach that he was known for. So when he talked to them, he said, you need to just speak one sentence at a time so I can evaluate each step along the way of what you're saying. And so there was always this kind of rivalry between the sophists and the philosophers, especially in the Socratic tradition. Yeah. And the Stoics are very much in the Socratic tradition. Now, Marcus Aurelius, the last famous Stoic, when he was a young man, he was appointed Caesar by the preceding emperor Antoninus Pius, but also his adoptive grandfather. He was adopted by Antoninus Pius, but that made his adoptive grandfather a more famous Roman emperor called Hadrian. So Hadrian was really one that chose Marcus Aurelius to be part of this long-term succession. And Marcus Aurelius had to study rhetoric, both in Greek and Latin. He was fluent in Greek rhetoric, although he was Roman. He was born at Rome. His family was Spanish. And so he was a highly accomplished, at least a fairly highly accomplished orator and speechwriter, both in Greek and Latin. And the Meditations, his book, is written in Greek. And so people read it, they like it. It survives because in some ways it's well written. People don't tend to think of it as a kind of literary masterpiece, but it is well written, and that's one of the reasons that people love it today. It's mainly lots of little passages or aphorisms, which is typical of a Stoic approach. And then in the 19th century, an Italian scholar called Angelo May found some letters, a cache of letters, between Marcus Aurelius and his rhetoric teacher, a guy called Marcus Aurelius Fronto, who was by Romans considered almost like a second Cicero. He was like in his day, a highly acclaimed teacher of rhetoric and a sophist, part of a movement called the Second Sophistic. And one of the odd things about those letters is that we can see Fronto becoming anxious about the fact that Marcus, in his late teens, is becoming more and more enamored of Stoic philosophy. And in particular, his Stoic mentor, a guy called Junius Rusticus. And we know that eventually Marcus kind of made this break and he went from studying rhetoric. He carried on studying and using rhetoric, But at some point he made a shift to thinking, no, my main thing, I'm going to major now, as it were, metaphorically, in Stoic philosophy rather than in rhetoric. Like a student who kind of changes a subject halfway through a degree course, a little bit, I would say. And you see Fronto getting a little bit anxious about losing his precious student, the future emperor. Right. He's also a close family friend. And these private letters that were never meant for publication, they give us a real insight into the private life of this famous Roman emperor. But Fronto says some interesting things to Marcus about what we're talking about right now, the relationship between rhetoric and philosophy. And Fronto says, look, he puts it very well, actually. He says, philosophers have to ask a lot of questions and they analyze things very deeply. In order to do that, they have to make fine distinctions that other people don't normally make. Like earlier when we talked about cognitive distancing, this is a concept that people can explain, but it's not a familiar concept to everybody. So sometimes they have to introduce neologisms, technical terms, and his way of putting it is that philosophers speak in paradoxes. Now, paradoxia in Greek means contrary to popular opinion. So they have to say things that people don't understand, that seem alien and strange to them, because they're struggling to kind of articulate subtle truths by the very nature of philosophy. And Fronto says, but the thing is, you have to be able to clothe these abstract concepts in words that people can understand. Otherwise, what's the point of it? And he's talking about for the benefit of others, but you could also say for your own benefit as well. And Fronto says Fronto has a very interesting idea of rhetoric, by the way. For such an influential rhetorician, he says something really quite stunning about what he thinks the discipline of rhetoric entails. He tells us this is the essence of rhetoric. And he doesn't describe the conventional tropes and so on. In methods, what he says very bluntly is that to be a great rhetorician, you have to put more effort than normal into trying to identify exactly the right word or phrase to express your meaning. And he says to do that, you have to study obscure poetry, you have to study culture, you have to know, you have to learn a lot of phrases and words from other writers, so that, you have this treasure trove that you can dip into. And he says when you're expressing something, you should use, he says, a novel phrase or word, because it will grab the attention of your audience, and it has to be a phrase that better expresses the meaning that you intend than the common way of articulating it. And he says if you're just using novelty for the sake of it, that's bad rhetoric. It needs to be novel and actually articulate your concept better than the common way of putting it would. And he says sometimes it takes me days or longer to come up with just one word for a speech to kind of really capture the point I'm trying to make. And that's remarkable. And he says to Marcus, when you're writing, you should practice taking philosophical sayings, he says, wise maxims, paradoxes, and he says rephrase them at least 2 or 3 times, trying to find the right metaphor or the right word or figure of speech to articulate it in a memorable and evocative manner. And so people read that in these letters by Fronto. It's partly him saying, look, you need rhetoric and philosophy to complement one another. And then they looked at the meditations and they thought, wow, it looks like that might be what he's doing in the meditations. So here in these letters, we have this guy telling him when he's a teenager, you should practice this writing exercise. And then we have his book, The Meditations, where he seems to be, that would explain the unusual format and structure of that book, where it's just a lot of disconnected sayings. And often he's repeating the same point many times, but expressing it in different ways, using different analogies and metaphors to get his point across. Right. Because he wants to really kind of nail the idea and make it, but this is for himself. Although it is possible that some of these things he's practicing to incorporate into speeches later. But I think it's mainly for his own benefit. He wants to come out with just the right phrase. We talked about these glasses. He says that our value judgments are like a beam of light shining on an object and illuminating it. And he said that, light illuminates objects. Pure light, the light of the sun, he said, should illuminate objects. and it's not exhausted by them, nor absorbed by them, nor deflected by them, but it just spreads over their surface. And he thinks this is what consciousness should be like, his way of articulating it. So we don't become, he's saying we shouldn't become too merged or identified too much, or too invested in the things that we're looking at, but in a kind of dispassionate way, just to illuminate them.
Yeah. It's incredible stuff. It's incredibly fascinating. And one of the things that I took away from listening to your book on how to think like a Roman emperor was this thing about the sort of almost anti-sophistry sort of thing of, it's not all about the flourishes and the emotion of it, like the message is the core part. And thinking, well, that's just most of the points in that are just as relevant today as they were all those years ago in very different society. And I sort of see so many people who get up on stages, and public speaking is maybe a much bigger thing now than it was then, but it's still a very lucrative profession for people, and it's still a very influential profession as well in many ways, and an influential tool for people who aren't professional speakers, although you could argue that in many ways politicians are professional speakers to some degree. But as the same kinds of things of like, is it to entertain and for your ego so you look good and the people love you, or is it actually to challenge people? And are you actually giving something of value to people that are taken away? Like you said you phrased it very well in the book, of it should be something that pauses you to think, not just something that you go along and you feel good whilst you're there. And it's like, we see a lot of that still, I think. Whereas I don't know how many times people actually go somewhere and feel challenged by somebody's talk, and maybe again that relates to some of this thing of people do not like being made to feel uncomfortable.
It's hard, and even today, for sure, there are politicians, there are self-development, personal development gurus, there are social media influencers, all in a sense descendants of the sophists. All in a sense using not rhetoric as it's normally understood, but certainly some kind of rhetoric that's part and parcel of what they do for a living. In that situation, it is difficult for people to avoid the temptation to just say stuff that gets a reaction. There are people that make an entire career out of being contrarian in the media and just saying things that they know are going to be shocking. There's a whole industry of that that's quite, in a sense, that's slightly sinister thing, like news programs paying the political opponents of their perspective to come on and say crazy stuff so that the audience has got, I can't believe what that dude just said on CNN, or it's outrageous. They just has this guy on Fox, they just said the most outrageous thing, and people get really worked up about it. But they that's engineered, right? They know that you're going to be provoked by certain things, and the guests do it on purpose. And also the way that the industry and political memoirs is great. Obviously, we're at the moment we have in mind the Trump presidency, but let's set aside Donald Trump himself. The number of people that have had $1 million book deals from the White House staff is outrageous, and it's an egregious problem. Because these people are earning far more money from book deals than they are from their jobs in government. And they thrive in chaos, because the more ridiculous and catastrophic the situation is that they're involved with, the more books they're going to sell when they comment on it later. We're kind of rewarding them for standing by and watching chaos happen. It's so potentially we reward people for saying things that are sensational or shocking, or we reward people just for telling us things that we already want to hear. You can't go far wrong just by figuring out what people want to hear and telling them exactly what they want to hear, but they're probably not going to learn that much from it. If you write a book and you only get positive reviews for it, it's probably rubbish, right? It's probably bland, right? Show me a famous, innovating, important historical figure that didn't have any critics. My favorite example of someone who did would be Charles Darwin. He was ridiculed mercilessly during his lifetime. People drew cartoons of him repeatedly in the newspaper, portraying him as a monkey. Like they thought he was the devil incarnate. They thought what he was saying was outrageous and ridiculous because he was saying something that was innovative and important. So even Shakespeare had bad reviews. One reviewer called him an upstart crow. Even long after his death, T.S. Eliot said he thought Hamlet was not a good play, it was a terrible play. Like, it didn't make any sense. Yeah. So I think if you're saying something meaningful and important and original, like Socrates, you're going to rock the boat, and there are going to be people that don't like that. And if you're just saying stuff that everybody likes, you're probably just appealing to the lowest common denominator in a sense. And, you're saying something that's vanilla and generic and bland. It's not interesting enough to be offensive to anyone. But if you speak the truth, there's always going to be people that don't like that. And it's not going to, you're not going to be embraced by, as big an audience. So there's always a tension. There's always a tension to sell out, right? Like if you say what people want to hear or what a media outlet want you to say, you're potentially going to be. And that was Socrates' concern with the sophists. He said, you guys are literally competing against each other to see who can get the biggest round of applause. He goes, there's no way that you can stand up there and stick to saying things that you genuinely believe. That's gone out of the window, right? You're just literally saying whatever you think is going to impress the audience more. And the next guy, regardless of whether it's true or false, or regardless of what the consequences for society are, it's just turned into a game for you. And he said that we need to kind of back away from that and, really get back to trying to really uncover the truth and think about the ethics of what we're saying and doing. And the Stoics were thoroughly immersed in that side of the Socratic tradition.
Interestingly, I've been running a series within my podcast about humor and presentations and comedy, and been lucky enough to get connected with a lot of professional comedians. And in the chats I've been having, it's been fascinating. But this makes me think of comedy as well. Whilst you were talking there, I was thinking about how true that is, and very obviously true, I think, in that world. Some of the people who are considered the most amazing comedians who've ever lived, or some of them no longer with us, but you sort of think to the most outrageous people, like Lenny Bruce is considered one of the sort of edgiest people out there, and he certainly was not short of critics, but he stayed true to his act and to what he wanted to do. And I think people like George Carlin as well, who I absolutely loved, was very much saying stuff that challenged people as well as being funny. And of course, not everyone is going to like that. But you can see there are so many people who go for the blander side of that, where they're trying to please pretty much everybody, never going to escape all criticism, but enough to be popular with the vast majority of people. We see very much that the people pleasing thing actually means you can't be true to your values,
and you can't be as creative either. As soon as you're creative and you present something new to people, especially if it's radically new, if you're coming at things from a new angle, then you're going to alienate some people. And it may be that people look back on you. Same with music, same with anything. 20 years later, you might be remembered as a historic innovator, but at the time, there's probably people that just don't get it, or can't stand it, precisely because it's new. That's the paradox. The paradox of innovation. There's always going to be some people that think it's a terrible idea. So the Stoics, it's not that they hate rhetoric. They just think it's like a loaded weapon, and we need to be more careful about how we use it. So particularly, we need to be careful about how we use rhetoric on ourselves. We see that clear as day in therapy. So there might be ways you could use rhetoric, to motivate yourself and so on, in a constructive way. That there's a way that there's room for using metaphors to communicate ideas in therapy and so on. But when you listen to the client's internal dialogue, when you ask them to write down their thoughts and tell you what's going on, if I sit in a consulting room in front of a client and I say, tell me how you're feeling, how did you feel about something that happened to you yesterday, and then I just listen to what they're saying. They're oblivious to the fact often that they're using selective thinking, like overgeneralization. They're using these kind of like vivid metaphors to evoke emotion, and rather than just describing the facts more objectively. So you get this kind of whole layer of like language being used to manipulate, distort emotion, and usually people are oblivious to the fact that they're doing it. It's just how they talk. Like, someone shot me down in flames, they tore a strip off me. You mean they said that they didn't agree with something you said? Like, you put it like that, it seems trivial, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, I guess so. Like, but it felt as if, but do you think it could be the language that you're using, like, that might be, and another thing I'd say is that people often think of the language as a consequence of their feelings. So they go, I felt really angry, so that was why I was talking about it like that and saying it was a disaster and this guy was an asshole and an idiot and stuff. And it's just how I feel. Like it's just the way I talk about it. Like it's, because I'm so angry about it. Like, so it's the feelings they think that cause them to talk about it like that. But what we'd normally say is, well, could it be also the other way around? Could it maybe also be the way you're talking about it is causing your feelings or maintaining them? Or the way I'd explain it to clients is, gosh, like I'm starting to get quite angry about it, listening to the way you describe it. But hang on a minute, like, maybe do you think it's the way you're describing it that's contributing to it? Because it's starting to make me feel quite anxious or quite angry. Like, I'm starting to think maybe you're right. Maybe this guy is an asshole. Like, maybe this is a complete disaster. You're pretty persuasive. Like, but do you not think maybe you're having that effect on yourself? And if that's deliberate, then fair play. But do you want to do that? Are you doing it on purpose? Well, obviously, no, I'm not doing it on purpose. Like maybe you should look more carefully at what's going on there.
Yeah. That was definitely one of the valuable things that I took away from your book was the decatastrophizing in life, and thinking, that's really something we can all benefit from and probably need to check in with ourselves more regularly than we generally do on things like that. But one of the other things that I also particularly got from that was about just the thinking about purpose in life, and that how much better the world would be if we all had at least more of a personal philosophy, even if it wasn't Stoicism. That people just don't seem to have their own philosophy. And what do you think that? I was trying to think of the right way to say this, but I mean, philosophy was really taught in schools, right? And in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, it was considered a primary subject, right? But it's not really now. So, is it something that you think should be being taught in schools?
I think it should be being taught in schools, but I think it's always going to be a problem for the state because, this sounds almost like kind of a radical thing to say, but I think it's obvious to say if you get kids to think too radically about politics, ethics, society, any state is going to start to feel a little bit anxious about whether you're raising a generation of revolutionaries or something, or look what happened to Socrates, right? Are we gonna have whole classrooms full of little Socrateses, questioning everything really deeply, man? Can we handle that? So I can see why society, the older generations, and also the state in general, and the education system, we ironically do have a vested interest in discouraging too much radical questioning. For sure. I mean,
those things.
People that work in education are well intentioned, but they are in a situation where it's difficult for them if the kids start to radically question the whole premise of the establishment that they're in, and things like that. The whole premises on which their teaching methods are based. If you question too many things, the whole thing starts to fall apart. So I can see. Do you
think then that if we taught more critical thinking and philosophy in schools, it would lead to anarchy? Is that?
Yeah, I think it might. I think that's the anxiety anyway. Would it in practice? I don't know. I think maybe it would cause a lot of disruption, but I think certainly people are motivated to keep it within certain bounds, because there's a fear that if kids start to question things too radically, that it will turn into something resembling anarchy, for sure. But like why don't we have a philosophy of life? I'll tell you, there are many reasons, but I'll tell you one. Because kids are born, they grow up, they look around, they copy what they see other people doing. Like that's how children develop to a large extent. They look up at their dad and the mum and see how they respond to things. Like, everyone can see that. Like children emulate their parents, like their peers. And then gradually they begin to think more independently for themselves, to go through these developmental stages. So one of the problems with that is that you get a kind of biased perception of things. I mean, I think someone could write an entire book very simply about the way in which our thinking is biased by the simple given fact that we learn about other people mainly by observing their external behavior. Like, for instance, we massively underestimate how prevalent mental health problems are, because people don't normally tell you that they have the 52% of Americans, the majority of Americans have at some point in their past met diagnostic criteria for a psychiatric condition, right? But if you're sitting on a bus, you wouldn't think most of the people on this bus, like, have had a mental health problem in the past or currently have one. Like, because they don't wear a little badge or have a hat on or something to tell you that. Like, so as a kid growing up, you're looking around and you develop you construct a picture of the world, which is false, right? It's not true. Like, partly because a lot of things are hidden from you. We underestimate how much debt people are in, because people don't wear a T-shirt saying I owe the bank like $100,000 or whatever. So we know, we know that debt is very common in many in America and in the UK and Canada. But people look around them and think, geez, that guy that I work with has got a fancy car. And how come he can afford all these expensive clothes and stuff? But often we don't realize how much debt people are getting in order to maintain these appearances. The people are living a lie, in a sense. Also, how prevalent physical chronic health conditions are. If we knew, somehow, if the world was more transparent and we knew what people were feeling, that they had backache or they were anxious about a surgery they had coming up and stuff, it would change the way we understand someone in the shop being a bit short with us, or a colleague, not paying attention properly in a meeting. So we misunderstand the dynamic of what's going on all around us all the time, because there's loads of really basic, important information that we just don't see. Simple stuff that people just like to keep private. So it's hidden, it's a world that's hidden from us. And so children grow up and they look around and they see this kind of fake version of the world around them. And that's kind of what they base their, generation after generation after generation, from ancient Greece down to present day. They get a fake view of the world as they're growing up by its very nature, right? And then they also see people trying to accumulate money and reputation. And they think, that must be important. Looks like it's the main thing. Everyone else seems to be doing it. If you were a kid and you're looking around, wouldn't you think a lot of people seem to think money's important, and property and reputation, status and stuff like that, right? But when people reflect on it, what the Stoics and Socrates said is that within our own hearts and in our own minds, when we reflect on these things, if we say, as Aristotle phrased it, actually, what do you want money for the sake of? If you dig deeper, it's just a means to an end. Nobody wants money for its own sake. It's just a bit of paper, or a number on a computer screen. It's for, Aristotle said, it's simply a tool. It's a means to an end. It's of no value in and of itself. It's only of value insofar as it contributes to eudaimonia, or fulfillment somehow, whether or not it even does. So people think it's going to lead to freedom or happiness or something like fulfillment, and that's why they pursue money. But often they lose sight of that and just become fixated on the means to the end and forget what it was that they wanted it for in the first place. And then that often leads them in the opposite direction. So they accumulate money in a way that leads them further and further away from fulfillment. But if you were a kid, you'd look around and think, I can't see that people are trying to get eudaimonia, that they're trying to become fulfilled. All I see is them running around after money and arguing about it, and and trying to defend their ego and boost their status and reputation and stuff. So you can see why people, like children growing up, generation after generation, get duped into thinking that externals are the meaning of life. And then, it's only through doing some sort of existential crisis almost that people, like the pandemic, for many people, they start to think, maybe all this shit won't make me happy. Maybe it doesn't really matter how many likes I get on Facebook or how big my house is. And the idea that we could all die. Even though actually in reality, the vast 99% of people are more likely to die, are going to die from something else.
Yeah.
Not coronavirus. And the pandemic has been trivialized by politicians and the media right out of the gate. To epidemiologists, it was clearly much more severe than the serious problem than many politicians were making it out to be, and the public got confused by that. Yeah. But nevertheless, at the same time, the fact is that you're more likely to die of heart disease or cancer. Something's definitely going to get you eventually. We all die eventually, but it's probably not going to be the coronavirus. But the fact that it looms large in our society, I think, has made a lot of people question their values, think about their mortality. And also things like in Toronto, where I lived before, I was amazed when I was a kid, eating out in a restaurant was something that you did. When I was a kid, maybe we did that twice a year. Maybe as I got older, I saw people would do it once every couple of weeks or something as a treat. Mm. Whereas now the young people in Toronto, I watch them and my friends eat out in restaurants almost every day, sometimes twice a day. Right. And there is no way economically that makes sense, because when you spend money in a restaurant or in a bar, that's gone. It disappears. It's an incredibly extravagant way to spend money. And so I think in lockdown, people have suddenly been, becoming more modest in their lifestyle in many cases. And I think it's led a lot of people to question whether they needed to do some of the things that they were doing before. Maybe they're even happier.
I've noticed that with some of my clients. So some of them are really appreciating being at home, and it's making them reevaluate things in their life and thinking, actually, I maybe don't need to be commuting all the time. Maybe there are more important things than working all these hours. And
people are reading a lot more books.
Yeah.
And some people tell me that they're happier doing that. They go for walks in the park on their own, they're happier doing that. And then the next question would be, so why were you before going out to bars all the time and fancy restaurants and things so much, if it was costing a lot of money and it wasn't really making you feel happy or fulfilled? And often the answer to that is, I don't know, it's just what people do. In other words, because other people were doing it, right?
Yeah.
And it was the prevailing culture, and I just kind of fell in with it. It was the norm. And again, it's it comes back to this thing of kids looking around and thinking, I don't know, what are you supposed to do in life? Apparently you're meant to go around chasing after money and fame. Yeah. It seems to be what everyone else is doing. But then in a crisis, people are that won't really make you happy. So, the Stoics want us to accelerate that process. Think right now about your own mortality. Don't wait until you're on your deathbed. It's too late then. Think about it now, and think about, what really is the purpose in your life? What's actually going to make you fulfilled? People spend a lot of time doing things. No one has ever had on their tombstone written, I wish I'd spent more time on social media.
You'd hope not. Right?
or on their deathbed. If only I'd spent more time on Facebook.
No, exactly.
If only I'd watched more YouTube videos or something. But the Stoics want us to do it now. Ask yourself right now. If you were on your deathbed, what do you think that you should have spent your time doing during life? You should live each moment as if it's your last, in a sense.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of recalibrating your values and thinking about what truly matters to you, so
Right.
that you don't just go along with the prevailing morality of the majority of people that you see on the outside, but you dig deeper inside and reflect on, what the point of these things really is.
It generally gets said that hindsight is 20/20, and this is almost a form of trying to step into your hindsight in the future and have it now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's we call it time projection sometimes in therapy. That's a very simple technique, but a very powerful one. One of the easiest things to do is just ask people. Imagine a year from now, 10 years from now, if you're looking back on the situation, like how would you feel differently about it? So how would you describe it differently? What advice would you give yourself? That's a technique I think everyone should do periodically because it's very,
I think
very helpful.
If Stoicism was like the dominant world philosophy prevalent everywhere, what do you think the world would look like?
What would the world look like if Stoicism was the dominant philosophy? I don't know if I could even envisage what it would look like, to be honest. I mean, I almost feel like we need the chaos and the confusion, and we have to have something to work on.
Right.
If life was perfect, it's the journey towards wisdom maybe that matters more than the goal itself. Although the founding text of Stoicism was a utopian text. Zeno's Republic did describe what you're asking for, which is a description of a utopian Stoic society. But his version, so I'm a little bit split, because if I told you what his utopian vision was, it wouldn't sound anything like how someone would describe it today. It sounds almost like a kind of anarcho-communist sort of state. Men and women wore the same clothes, law courts were abolished, currency was abolished, property is held in common, children are raised in common, there's no legal conflicts, no wars, everybody's equal, everybody's admitted regardless of race or gender, nobility of birth, physical condition or whatever. So these are the things we're told about the Stoic Republic. I think that it would have to be a more modest lifestyle that people adopted, where there was more consideration extended towards poorer nations, and a greater emphasis on international law and human rights.
Yeah. Do you think there's anyone who even comes close to like the philosopher king style of leadership of Marcus Aurelius?
Not today. I don't think so. People often ask that question and they want me to kind of point. I really couldn't find. There are politicians that I might admire certain qualities of, but no, because all politicians in the current climate are or certainly the majority of them are morally compromised to some extent by things like the sources of funding that support them, the relationship with big media outlets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So the very system in which they operate, I think, makes it virtually impossible for them to embrace philosophical values. The answer I usually give to this question is that if someone asked me to identify the people that I've met in life that most closely resemble a Stoic sage, in all honesty, they're people that were like regular guys and women that you would never have heard of, who lived in small towns, in relative obscurity. And several of them are people who are recovering drug addicts or alcoholics. So they're not famous politicians or celebrities. So they're people that just lead a very simple life and maybe hit rock bottom and then clawed their way back from it and decided that they want to try and make the world a better place and help other people and are quite sincere about it. And those are people that left an impression on me and made me think that they embodied some of these cardinal virtues of Stoicism. But they're not people that live in the limelight.
Do you ever ask yourself, what would Marcus Aurelius do in this situation?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, the Stoics actually tell us to do that. So Epictetus told his students to several times, he'd say, ask yourself what Zeno would do or what Socrates would do. And I think sometimes people get confused by the history, right? So when you ask that question, you always get somebody giving a smart aleck response, I don't know, he'd probably have lots of slaves to deal with the problem for him or something like that, you know. But it's the principle that matters. What would somebody do if they had courage and self-discipline and stoic wisdom? They believe that virtue is the only true good. So this is why the Stoics say what we should do is construct a hypothetical sage, a hypothetical ideal, a kind of abstract way, and think, what would the sage do? What would the perfect wise man or woman do in this situation? So we don't get distracted by the historical details associated with any particular role model. But often I'll think, what would Marcus Aurelius or what would Socrates or what would somebody else do? There's lots of techniques like this we use in therapy. One of my favourite ones is, if you imagine there's like a whole panel of people that are completely impartial, completely rational observers, and then you try to explain to them why you think your boss is an asshole, or why you think it's just an unbearable injustice that your neighbour was rude to you in the street yesterday or something like that, or whatever. And you're in court and you're trying to put your case to them, and then imagine how they might respond and the questions they would ask you and what they think about it. Because it's kind of it's like looking in a mirror or something and realizing how absurd. Often a lot of these techniques are really just about making us more aware of the arbitrariness and absurdness of some of our existing attitudes.
You recently had a big chat with Ryan Holiday. What did you guys end up talking about?
I think we were talking about Marcus Aurelius, a little bit about the history and stuff. So I did his podcast, and I'm very interested in what Ryan does because it's a different approach and it's a different audience that he has. So I think it's really cool that he's embraced Stoicism, and I kind of enjoy chatting to Ryan.
Were there any points of difference that came up? Or?
No, I think we agree. I've never really talked to him about things that we disagree about. We just kind of get chatting about Stoicism and about Marcus Aurelius, and I think at least in the discussion that we had, we kind of pretty much just agreed with each other, and we were just enjoying talking about our hobby.
I found his books and your book and a lot of your online content as well to be some of the most accessible ways into understanding stoicism and being able to apply that. And I said to you before we started recording, one of the things I really loved about your audiobook was that you recorded it, and because you don't often hear regional accents in audiobooks, and it was really refreshing to hear your voice and hear a Scottish accent in an audiobook. And you, of course, you read your own material very well, so it was very enjoyable.
It was a bit of a gamble because my publisher wanted us to use a voice actor, and we had a bit of a debate about it, but I had to go to Austria. I was going to Austria to Carnuntum, where Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, and so we only agreed at the last minute that I would record the audiobook, and so I had to do it in pretty grueling 8 or 9 hour sessions. You'd maybe normally just do a couple of hours at a time in the studio. What's hard about that is you have to sit on a stool in front of a little light, so it's kind of like 8 hours solid or whatever on your back. It's kind of hard work. Yeah. And then just kind of saying the same things over and over again. But we did it, and I had my bags with me, I remember, and I went straight from the recording studio to the airport to catch my flight. Just finished just in time, and just in the nick of time for I to catch my flight to Austria.
It doesn't come across in the book. It just sounds.
Does it sound okay? Right. I had to. It was in the studio that does Paw Patrol. The kids.
I know of it.
Cartoon.
I've never actually watched it, but yeah.
No, not a fan. No,
I don't have kids.
But they normally do Paw Patrol, but you said earlier about I can't think of anything that Ryan says that I particularly disagree with, except in Obstacles the Way. He mentions some of the role models he mentions aren't people that I would have picked as role models. But that's inevitable. When I reviewed that book, I said, I think we have to assume that that's bound to happen if you pick political figures and so on. But there are people that write books on Stoicism that I don't agree with. And sometimes it's because they'll make psychological claims. Like I love Bill Irvine's book, but there's bits of it that I don't agree with in terms of psychology or the interpretation of Stoicism. And then there's books sometimes by people who try to make Stoicism into this kind of macho thing, where it's like toxic masculinity almost. It's kind of this idea of like being hyper, like tough, and they're confusing it with lowercase stoicism sometimes. Like it's a kind of cynical philosophy where you just don't really give a shit about anything and don't let anything hurt your feelings, and but there's no social dimension to it, no compassion or anything like that at all. So Stoicism was one of the main influences on early Christian ethics. And when you bear that in mind, all the stuff about brotherly love, ethical cosmopolitanism, all that comes into Christianity in part from Stoicism. So then these people that kind of think it's all about having a stiff upper lip and not giving a shit about other people, like that clearly isn't compatible with that whole dimension of Stoicism. Sometimes what I say to them is, when you read Marcus Aurelius, have you noticed that on almost every page of the Meditations, he talks about compassion, natural affection, justice, fairness, kindness towards others, cosmopolitanism, or social virtue, basically, in general. It's one of the main topics of the entire book. And what really interests me is that sometimes people who kind of want this macho, stiff upper lip interpretation of Stoicism will say, I didn't notice any of that. Like, they've read the entire book and they just haven't, they've had a kind of blind spot. It's like almost every page he's talking about this stuff, but they just ignored that. And again, it's like selective thinking. It reminds me of a quote from William Blake. He said, "We both read the Bible day and night, but you read black where I read white." Like, so they've managed to read this entire book and they say they love this book, but they hadn't noticed like half of what was written in it. So I'm in favor of kind of redressing that imbalance by putting more emphasis on the social virtue side of Stoicism, the cosmopolitan tradition that stems from it, and also what the Stoics have to say about anger and love, and the interpersonal emotions. That was always integral to Stoicism, but for some of the people that are writing about it now, that's completely left out.
Yeah, I guess that I loved your book and I love the way you put it, and I agree with you on all these values. I think they're important and we want to see more of that. To me, that is, Marcus Aurelius is still one of the, if not the greatest example of great leadership, how it can be done when you have someone who has wisdom and compassion and makes the best decisions they can and keeps themselves humble as well. I think, so I can't think of anyone else that really comes close. But like the book that you wrote about him dresses things up so well, puts the case so well, and you can start off talking about his deathbed experience. Actually, that was kind of interesting. I just maybe want to come to that before we sort of wrap things up. But when you were talking about the deathbed experience, you're talking about kind of things that were going on in his mind. Is that stuff that you were imagining was going on in his mind, or where did that?
The last chapter of the book, almost like a couple of. See, I should have said more about this in the book. If I do a second edition, I'll fix this, because there were a couple of people reviewed that book, and one person reviewed it and they said they described it as a novel. And a couple other people reviewed it and said, well, I thought the Stoicism was good, but I don't understand why he made up all these stories about Marcus Aurelius. And I thought, look at the footnotes. Like, they're all derived from the surviving Roman histories, right? This is biographical. Like, it's based on the historical evidence. And like, these are true stories, or at least they're based on the historical accounts that we have. It's not fiction. It's historical biography, and all of it's referenced. In the last chapter, some people said, "Oh, someone emailed me once." Like, I hope they don't take offence if I mention this. I won't mention their name, but someone emailed me and said, "I liked your book, but I thought the last chapter was terrible." Because I just can't imagine that Marcus Aurelius would have said any of these things. Like, and you're just putting words in his mouth. And I said, like, that entire chapter is just based on paraphrases from, like, and it's mainly just direct quotes that I've rearranged. almost all of them are from Marcus Aurelius, and there's like 2 or 3 from Seneca or Epictetus, like, that I've inserted. But it's mainly just a kind of reshuffled paraphrase of different translations of the Meditations, but also I read a little bit of Greek. Like, so when I was doing the book and writing with Marcus, running my courses, I have the dual text and I consult the original Greek. Like, so some of it maybe is kind of more based on what the original Greek says, and some of it's based on some of the common translations. But those are all essentially Marcus Aurelius's words. But maybe I should have a footnote that kind of like emphasizes that. I thought it was strange that somebody said Marcus Aurelius would never have said something like that. It was like, it's just, there's a quotes from Marcus Aurelius, like, it's, or paraphrases from him. But what I did was organize it more thematically, because Meditations isn't organized thematically. It jumps around from one subject to another. So I wanted to kind of make it flow more like a speech. And also when I wrote it, because it was, I knew that there was going to be an audiobook, I specifically wrote the last chapter so that when people listened to it in the audiobook, it would be like a guided meditation. And I thought, I'm not even going to say anything, I'm just going to do that and see if anybody kind of experiences that way. And sure enough, a lot of the reviewers, people that have emailed me, said, oh, you know, I just listened to the last chapter like 4 or 5 times. I listen to it in my car every day. So it's like I treat it like a visualization technique or something. And I thought, maybe it's over the top, folks. It's all about dying. And I thought, you know, maybe it's too much. And I thought, no, I'll just do it anyway and see what people think. But like, generally when people have reviewed it, that's their favorite part of the book.
Yeah,
apart from that one person that didn't like it.
No, I did like it. I like the sort of whole thing of not necessarily embracing death, just seeing it as inevitable and it's just something that's going to happen, and being okay with it, being at peace with it. That was like, you know, if you have a choice of how you're going to go, that's a good way to go.
Oh, here's like I like to one day, sometime I'll do an interview where I talk more about the process of writing. Because I'm not very experienced at it, and I suppose I've been writing books for quite a long time and stuff, but I don't really think of myself as a professional writer, like, although that is pretty much what I do all the time now.
Yeah.
I'm now doing a graphic novel, which seems really weird to me. I don't know very much about comics and graphic novels, but I'm well and truly in the middle of doing it now. So part of the process of writing that book was, I thought, I mean, with the publisher and so on, we kind of arrived at the conclusion that we'd do a chronological account of Marcus Aurelius' life. And then I thought, okay, so there's clearly a problem with this, because it starts off kind of with a training montage or whatever. You start off with his education, which I love. It's the most interesting part for me, actually. But it's kind of a little bit, it's not a very dramatic place to open the book. And so I thought, okay, what's a way to dig deep and look for a radical solution to that? And I thought, well, let's start with him dying. That's pretty dramatic. Yeah. And then we can go back and go through the rest of his life in chronological order. Like, so that wasn't obvious at first. I thought, let's start with him dying. Okay, now we've got something kind of dramatic for the first chapter. And then we can go into the kind of like his education and stuff. And then I thought, well, this creates a problem for me, because now I'm not really sure how to end the book. Because then we have the civil war with Avidius Cassius, and then what happens after that is that Commodus then goes and ruins everything, basically, and overturns a lot of things that his father did. And I thought, well, we don't really want to get into that because it's not that relevant to the story, and it's a bit of a negative note to end on anyway, historically. So I thought, how the heck am I going to end this story? Like, I've written it backwards. And I thought, I've no idea. I'll just have to write it and then I'll figure it out when I get to the end, hopefully, touch wood. And then as I was writing, I thought, I know what I'm going to do. Like, I can't think of a way to end it. I feel like at the end, we have to cover him dying. And I thought, well, what if I could do it twice? Like, so we have him dying in the first chapter and also in the last chapter. I thought, I can't do that. It's the same thing twice. And I thought, well, what if I tell it from a completely different perspective? And then I thought, what if I shift to a first-person perspective? And at the time, that seemed like a ridiculous idea. I've never read a book that changes to first person perspective in the last chapter, or like so abruptly. So I thought it seems weird. Like, can I get away with doing this? I don't know. Are you allowed to do that?
I feel it worked. Yeah.
I think there was one person that said, "Why the hell has it suddenly changed to first person in the last chapter?" But everyone else seemed to be good with that. And so that was my attempt to figure out how I could solve this problem of the narrative structure. If we tell his story, it needs to start off and end with something memorable.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm going to use a framing story where I tell the same story, part of the story twice, but from a different perspective. That's an odd thing to do. But yeah, like you say,
it's a great device. I feel it worked very well. So I'm very, very cognizant of time, and it's been really wonderful chatting with you. But I'm also aware, you have your own life to live outside of being a podcast guest as well. And so I want to bring things to a close by asking that hopefully people, even if they haven't come across Stoicism before, have a little bit more of an idea about that, and also why it's such an interesting area. I think it's relevant in leadership. I think it's relevant in speaking, public speaking, and really just to all of life. I mean, just philosophy of life is so important. How can people who may be coming across you for the first time find out more about you and come and connect with you on social media?
Well, my website is just donaldrobertson.name. It's just my name, and instead of .com, it's .name. And if they go there, I've got a lot of e-learning courses and downloads and stuff about Stoicism they can check out. And my blog, I've got a Medium blog that I've put a lot of stuff on, and I've written 6 books. They can check out the other ones as well if they want. And all my social media links are there. But also I'm one of the founding members of a non-profit organization called Modern Stoicism, and its website is modernstoicism.com. It's run by a multidisciplinary team of volunteers, so classicists, philosophers, psychologists, and it was founded by Christopher Gill, who's Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought in Exeter University in England. So it's Modern Stoicism that organises Stoic Week and the Stoicon Conference and all this kind of stuff, and everything it does is basically free. And I should also plug, we had the Stoicon Conference scheduled for Toronto, and obviously we had to cancel that because of the pandemic. So we now have a virtual conference on the 17th of October. And just for kicks, we decided to do it by donation. So people can just pay whatever they like for a ticket. And it'll be interesting to see how many people. I'm assuming that we're going to get a lot of people attending that way. I just announced it a couple of weeks ago, and I think we've got about 150 people that have already registered. And that was just teasing it. So I'm guessing we're going to have 300 or 400 people attending once we actually start the campaign to promote it online properly.
Oh, I'll have to get the link from you, and we'll get the episode out before that comes up, so that maybe get a few more people on.
Get some people to come along, and they'll see a lot of talks by different authors and experts in Stoicism.
Fantastic. So to bring things to a close then, what would be one word of advice or a call to action or a thought that you would like to leave people with today?
I thought that I would like to leave. I think that I always write in books. If anyone ever asked me to sign a book, and anyone that's got a book that I've put my name on one of this, I always write a quote from Horace that's "Dare to be wise." And I think the fundamental thing is to really just the clues in the name, philosophy, the love of wisdom, to actually value truth and wisdom, and to think it's worth spending time and effort reflecting on your values. That's what Socrates wanted more than anything, was just to persuade people that an unexamined life is not worth living, and that, just the desire, the craving to really penetrate more deeply and really understand ourselves and really understand our own beliefs and values, I think is the main thing, and don't let anyone else kind of distract you from that in life. That's the way to get in touch with your true goal in life and kind of start to get back on the path to eudaimonia and personal fulfillment, I believe.
That's great. It's great thought to end up on. I can personally highly recommend How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and well worth the time to listen or read, whichever version you prefer. But Donald Robertson, thank you for joining me today. I've learned a lot speaking with you, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Cool. Likewise. Thanks for inviting me along.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you'd like to know more about Stoic philosophy, I do recommend checking out Donald's book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. He also has a lot of free resources online and on his website, so do check those out too. Very good and active Facebook group all about Stoicism and what is and isn't Stoicism, and often people asking lots of questions in there could be a good place to find out more. Next week, I'm going to have with me a master in the area of entrepreneurship and business, and this is the author and entrepreneur Daniel Priestley, who's written books like How to Be a Key Person of Influence, Entrepreneur Revolution, Oversubscribed, 24 Assets, prolific writing, and definitely a great guy to be interviewing. We had a fantastic chat, and I know you're not going to want to miss that. Please make sure you are liked and subscribed to the show. We'll see you next time. Have a great week.